This is an interesting one. We're calling, it's Gabriel, just calling from the United States of America. Gabriel, you're live on Truth Wanted.
Hello. So, my thing was, or my question actually, was for Joe. What is your depiction on salvation? Because I heard you say earlier that you don't believe in the resurrection, and that kind of got me a little bit concerned.
Yeah. No, I don't believe that salvation has anything to do with heaven or hell. I don't believe in heaven or hell, either one. And a lot of people have an issue that I don't believe in heaven. A lot of progressive Christians have an issue that I don't believe in heaven. But most progressive Christians don't believe in hell as it is. And if you read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, you wouldn't believe in hell either. But they have a lot of issues with me not believing in heaven, and I just don't see evidence of heaven either. I think that the invitation of heaven that apocalyptic Jewish theologians were talking about was an invitation of heaven here on earth, which means a place that has no oppression, a place where everybody gets to exist and live in a good way, where they get to actually live and not simply survive, which is the reality for most of us. Most of us are here in the world surviving only. And for some of us, it's worse than for others. You know, if you're looking at the people dying of hunger, they are literally surviving every hour of every day. So when I talk about salvation, or when I when we talk about salvation, I talk about salvation from that, salvation from systems of oppression, salvation from ensuring that you don't exist in the world anymore, that we create a world where people are not just surviving, but they get to exist, they get to live, they get to take up space, they get to be everything that they want to be, they get to enjoy life. So to me, salvation is that. Salvation is about saving not just ourselves, but saving our communities and everybody around us from systems of oppression, ensuring that nobody dies because they don't have enough food, ensuring that nobody dies from preventable diseases, but instead that everybody's taken care of, that we care for one another, that there is no hoarding of power and wealth that ensures that somebody is going to be exploited and abused, but that instead we are caring for our literal neighbors, that we're caring for. I mean, I live in San Diego. My literal neighbors are people in Tijuana who are right now in cages because they are trying to get to the US because of systems of oppression by governments. And so salvation to me means caring about them, caring for them. And we do that in our life, in my practical life. I do things to ensure that they are well, or as well as they can be. So salvation for me has nothing to do with the afterlife. It has nothing to do with, where your soul goes when you die. It has everything to do with how can we create a world where people are cared for, where we minimize trauma, and when people do have trauma, we offer the best possible tools and the best possible support for them so that it doesn't become a maladaptive coping mechanism and a harmful personality. But instead that it becomes a growth opportunity. So when I talk about salvation, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the afterlife. Don't care. I don't know what's going to happen when we die, and I genuinely don't care.
Spoiler alert, I don't either. So, but I know you weren't asking me that. Gabriel, what do you think?
Well, I really take the verses where Jesus says that the Father, there's a verse, I don't remember exactly where at, but he says the Father and I are one, which brings me to believe there is God the Father. But then another thing here's something else, is in Revelation chapter 21, verses 7 and 8, says, "He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." And that's another thing that kind of indicates, hey, like to me at least, hey, there is a hell, because hell is described as a lake that burns with fire and brimstone.
I mean, that's fair. If that's your belief, if that's what you believe and your belief serves you and is good for you, then I completely respect your belief. It is important to note, however, that the verses where Jesus talks about the Father, and where the only gospel in which Jesus is seen as a God, is John. And John was written 50 to 70 years after Jesus died. And a lot of narratives had been already spun about who Jesus was. But if you read the earliest kind of versions, and if you read Mark, which is the earliest one, there is no conversation about Jesus being God at all. It's just Jesus being the Messiah, which doesn't mean he's God. It means that he was the one that was sent to be the king of the Jewish people, to be able to bring them out of the oppression that they had experienced. This was a literal a liberation of the oppression of the empires. And the book of Revelation is exactly that. The book of Revelation is a conversation of what is it going to look like that we are going to end oppression. And this is happening, after the temple has been destroyed in 70 CE, and the oppression of the Jewish people has intensified. The oppression of Christians has intensified too. And so they are trying to grapple with their oppression. And this man who is being oppressed is writing, which we don't know who wrote Revelation, is writing to give them hope and say everything is going to be okay. And he writes in all of this allegorical kind of language, but it's not literal language. Revelation is not a book to be taken literally. It's a book to be taken allegorically, but again, if the belief serves you, that's completely fine.
Yeah. See,
I do understand that Revelation does have a lot of metaphor, but go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, as far as the scholarly consensus, I think I agree with Joe in that. I think that Revelation is meant to be taken as metaphor. I think we really don't know a lot about the book of Revelation. As Joe said, we don't even really know who wrote it. They say it's John of Patmos, but that's not even really a thing. That's kind of a thing that was invented for that book, really. So yeah, it's a book full of metaphor that we don't fully understand, and I think to take much out of it for me is really hard to do, because I don't know what the author's intent even was. And even if I did know the author's intent, I don't know if he was right. I don't know how he got his information, and I don't know if it's reliable. So I don't know. Quoting the Bible for a lot of those kinds of reasons is hard for me to understand any kind of theology. But Book of Revelation in particular is especially hard to do, because it is one of the craziest books of the Bible. And this is the Bible here we're talking about. It's full of crazy stuff, but it's one of the ones where we know the least about exactly what it's talking about. And scholars disagree all the time on this book, and we'll never have a real consensus on it. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to take anything.
It's one of the books of the canon that has been the most debated.
Yeah.
We're talking about Martin Luther and John Calvin thinking that it shouldn't be a part of the canon at all.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because it really is an anti-empire book. It's a book that is talking against the empire, against oppression. And, it has a lot of narratives that are complicated and messy if you live in an empire, which we do.
I mean,
there you go.
Another thing is on this subject is where Jesus goes into Galilee, he goes in there saying that the kingdom is at hand, talking about heaven. He says to repent and believe in the gospel. So what are your views on that one?
I believe that when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, which was really the kingdom of God, it's just that Jewish people don't use the word God, so they call it the kingdom of heaven, because they believe that their deity lived literally in the sky, in the clouds. That's Jewish Jewish ancient cosmology, that is. But when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, he's talking about these you have to read apocalyptic Jewish narratives. You have to read that they were expecting to have oppression end. They wanted to go back to the time of David and Solomon, where they were not being oppressed, but they were being taken care of, and there was a lot of prosperity, and the Hebrew people were well. So when they talk about the kingdom of heaven, that's what they are talking about. And when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he is not saying that people, that there is going to be this other place. Ancient Jewish apocalyptic people didn't believe that there was another place, another realm where they were going to live. They believed that here on earth, they were going to be able to have heaven. And so that's what he's talking about. He's saying the kingdom of heaven is here. Like, according to what we have of Jesus, this man, Jesus, believed that he was the Messiah and that he was the king and that he was going to be set as the king that was going to bring this kingdom of heaven, and the oppression of the Jewish people was going to end. But he didn't mean that literally, like David and like Solomon were kings. He meant that in a more spiritual way. It's by ending the oppression of people, actively moving to end the oppression of people. So he's talking about to his disciples, he's saying, you have the power to do that. Just resist oppression, which is kind of what, liberation theology teaches. Like, you have the power to do that. Resist oppression now. Resist oppression. Just don't be okay with oppression and bring the kingdom of heaven. But the kingdom of heaven is this space where people are not being abused and oppressed. But it's not an other realm where we are going to live later on. It's not that. That's not what ancient Jewish people believed.
It's a pretty radical thing to hear coming from somebody who did grow up in a more fundamentalist streak of Christianity. But, to give credit to your view, I mean, there isn't a single, there's some verses in the Bible that talk about heaven and stuff, but it's never really matched up with like traditional understandings of heaven and the imagery we see of being on the clouds with angels and stuff like that. It's that they talk about the streets of gold and stuff in Revelation, but like that's after like there's a new earth and stuff, and it gets really messy and really fast. And again, we don't particularly know if they're talking about a literal thing or a metaphorical thing. It gets really confusing, especially when we're looking at old books with languages we don't fully know. And to a belief in time of people 2,000 years ago, we're never going to fully know exactly what they're talking about. And I obviously, again, don't believe in any literal heaven either. So it's no point to me. I know you're obviously talking to Joe, but yeah. One any last question, Gabriel, before we move on, or any other points you wanted to make? If not, then I'll leave you on your trails.
Well, Joe did say something about there being spiritual views. You do have to consider as well, heaven is a spiritual place. So is hell. They're both places within the spiritual plane. I
don't
know what that means, to be honest with you, Gabriel. I don't know what that means.
I honestly, I believe hell is a reality here and now for people. I believe hell is dying of hunger. I believe that hell is not having enough, not knowing if you're going to survive tonight. I believe hell is being trafficked, and not being able to get out of that life. I believe that hell is but that's my belief, and it's fair. Like, right. It's a fair belief. But if you believe that hell and heaven are spiritual realities, you are absolutely fine to believe that. It's just not a belief that serves me. It's a belief that instead was used against me to abuse me, to spiritually manipulate me. And so I don't align with those beliefs anymore because they don't serve me. And I agree with Dan. I don't even know what it means. What does it mean? I don't know what it means. So I believe in hell, but I believe in hell here. I believe people live in hell here, and I've met some of them.
Yeah.
And that I can deal with that. I can do something about that, but I cannot do anything about a hell later on that I don't know much about. I like Little Nas X's hell though. That looks cool.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that Little Nas video, but man, as soon as those shoes were out, I was like, how much are they though? Can I get some of those shoes? But of course they're like $1,000 and they're sold before I could even consider it. But and I even cringe a little bit, Joe, when you say like, if that works for you, then that's fine, because like beliefs of heaven and hell for me were very traumatic. And for me, and it's like that's one of those ones too where it's like I really don't want other people to believe that, if I'm being completely honest with myself. If that's something I could change, I might change that, because like how much of my upbringing was, how much of my decision making rather was influenced by this idea of my eternal salvation, of what could be changed in that, and what I was afraid of, and how much of the good that I do in life was motivated in fear.
Yeah, and that's totally, I get that. And that's why I teach about this. So if you go in my Instagram, I have whole entire stories, like story highlights, where I deconstruct the notion of heaven and hell, and I go into the Greek and I go into the Hebrew, and I explain where they come from and how they were constructed, and how in the Middle Ages they paid artists. The church paid artists
Yep.
to be able to create imagery that was able to convince people. And we have to understand that people didn't have access to the Bible at this time. Nobody was reading the Bible to be able to say, like, no, that's not what it says. People believed what the powerful said, and people believed what the powerful gave them to paint and to write about.
Yeah.
So these constructs of heaven and hell have been created in the last 1700 years with a specific intentions. So I help people deconstruct all of that, and I help them go through the process of deconstructing, but I can't make them deconstruct it. And so I have to respect that they believe it. I don't have to respect if they indoctrinate other people into it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Good clarification there. Good clarification. So Gabriel, thanks for calling in. Appreciate your call and your questions.